So I've just turned on our recording. Wanted everybody to know that, so that we can have this session available for folks going down the road who aren't able to join us today. My name is Brian Brennan. I'm the Executive Director of the 21st Century Alliance. Really grateful to all of you for being here with us today. The 21st Century Alliance is focused on 3 issue areas. It's building enough homes, it's educating our kids in the way that they deserve, and it's in thoughtful and accountable governance. We work in 2 areas. Those of us who work in public policy know that you need good policy, but the good policy doesn't work very well. It doesn't matter a whole lot if you don't have good politics as well. So we, the 21st Century Alliance, try to work in both spaces, but particularly on the politics side. In our 3 issue areas, we work to raise money for candidates who are willing to do hard things, to do good work in public policy. And we also work to build an alliance of entities that are all pushing in the same direction. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, in a moment, share my screen. Here we are. Hope everyone can see this okay. And where's my, there we go. These are some of the entities that we work with at the 21st Century Alliance, all folks who recognize that a focus on housing supply, on K-12 education, on thoughtful governance at the state level is going to be critical to the well-being of California over the long term. We work with these partners not because we necessarily agree with them on everything, but we agree with them on one or more issue area on which we work. And we believe that you can't get anything done in California if you don't work together. Today, however, we're here focused on good policy, focused on using the best data to enact the right policies for our state over the long term. So we're very fortunate to have a wonderful panel here with us. What we're going to do is we're going to start our session with an overview of some of the recent academic results that have been released at the national level and at the state level. And then we'll engage in a panel conversation with plenty of time for Q&A. Many of the folks who are going to be joining the call today are themselves expert in one facet or another of K-12 education. So I really encourage you to not be shy about participating. What I'd like to do is first introduce Niu Gao from PPIC, and then after she does a brief overview of the data, we'll then introduce our 2 other panelists, Marshall and Vince. So Niu Gao, we're delighted that you're here. PPIC has a reputation, that precedes it. Niu Gao got her master's and PhD from Florida State University in education policy, and before coming to PPIC was a research analyst at Stanford. So she's a wonderful person to kick things off with an overview of our data. Niu, I'll be happy to advance the slides as you work through them. So please just, you can cue me orally or what have you to move those along. So Niu, the floor is yours. I'm going to move to our first slide now.
Great, thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's event. So in the last few weeks, we've seen a lot of data coming from the federal and also state assessments. Those data taken together point to the far-reaching impact of the pandemic on student learning. So we've seen test scores declining across the board. And in the next few minutes, I will highlight 3 key takeaways from the national and also state data. So first, just to provide some national context, before COVID-19, California had been underperforming compared to other states. In this chart, we're showing the average test scores in 8th grade math. So the light blue line is the national average, and the red line in the bottom is California. And you can see that average test scores in California are lower than the national average. I'm also showing the test scores for other large, diverse states, including Florida, Illinois, New York, and Texas. So generally speaking, California lags behind other states. During COVID-19, we've seen those states enacted very different policies when it comes to student teaching, when it comes to student learning and also teaching. And as a result, partially due to some of those policy factors, states had experienced very different levels of test score decline. Next slide, please. Thank you. Second, test score declined across the board, but the largest drops are in 4th grade and also 8th grade math. In fact, 8th grade math actually saw the largest drop in average test scores as well as proficiency rates. In this figure, I am highlighting the sharp drop in 8th grade math proficiency rates indicated by the red line in the bottom. This is very alarming for a few reasons. For one, 8th grade is usually when students start accelerating in math. So for instance, students will start taking Algebra 1 or equivalent. So by the time they get into high school, they're ready for geometry or equivalent. And this sets very good pathway into college. So the drop in 8th grade math actually has really important implications for students' readiness for high school as well as their readiness for college. Next slide, please. And last, students from marginalized groups had bigger decline. In 8th grade math, the average proficiency rate dropped by 25%, but the decline is bigger for Black, Latino students, low-income students, and English learners. What's not shown here in this chart is that many students left the public schools during the pandemic. So for instance, in the fall of 2020, a few months into the distance learning, Black students' enrollment statewide declined by a shocking 5%. This is much larger than anticipated, and this is also larger than the statewide average. Because we know Black students had lower test scores, so if we take that into account, the actual test score decline may be worse than what we're seeing here. So just to summarize the key takeaways, California lags behind other states, and during COVID-19, we've seen test scores dropping across the board, but 8th grade math had the largest drop, and also students from marginalized groups experienced bigger test score declines. So this is the end of my presentation, so I'm going to turn over to Brian, who can start the panel conversation.
Great. New, thank you very much. Appreciate it. What we're going to do now, first I'd like to introduce our other two panelists who will be joining New, and then we'll throw out a few questions. Please feel free to share your questions in the chat as they come up, and you can also ask real time. So we're going to be fairly informal with our conversation. First, we're joined by Marshall Tuck. Marshall has been advising education nonprofits, school districts for a long time. He's a two-time also candidate for State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Delighted, Marshall, to have you here with us. Vince Stewart is here with us as well. He's Vice President of Policy and Programs from Children Now. He's worked in the public sector, in philanthropic community, with higher education as well, and has a really, between the three of them, we really have a great set of expertise. So with that, we're going to jump right in. So let me ask a general question of each of our panelists. What, in your view, are the most important takeaways from these data this week? And any one of you can jump in first.
Brian, I'm happy to kick things off. And first, let me start by just saying thank you to you and the 21st Century Alliance for the invitation to join this group today. You know, I think for me, when we look at either the NAEP scores or the Smarter Balance results, sort of the takeaways are that it wasn't really surprising. I mean, the results are certainly shocking, but I think we anticipated that this was likely to occur. There are, though, three things that sort of really called my attention out. One is that the achievement gaps, I think, are continuing to grow. I think we sort of saw the last few years, achievement gaps were sort of holding steady in some respects, sort of like all the additional investments and the improvements we were making were sort of, a rising tide lifts all boats. And we weren't seeing necessarily a closing of the achievement gaps. So this demonstrates we have a widening of the achievement gaps. I also think that there's this issue of students aren't doing better over time when we look at the NAEP scores, particularly I think as Stu was calling out the math scores from 4th to 8th grade. We're not seeing students improve as they move through the system, which I think is a really big concern. And then thirdly, I just would point to the science results of the Smarter Balance assessment. I think that's particularly alarming. We have only about 11% of Black students and 15% of the Latino students who are making the standard there. And we put so much effort in the last few years in STEM instruction, and to see those sorts of declines, I think is really going to be a setback. And particularly when you think of science as being a subject that has relevance and is hands-on and can be very engaging for students to get them interested in their education. I think that's something we need to take note of.
Yeah, Vince, thank you. Marshall?
Yeah, I just would agree with Vince in terms of not surprising, right? As someone who used to run schools, I think of learning pretty simply, right? It's how much time do kids have to learn? What is the quality of that learning and teaching, and what is the readiness of children to learn? If you think about just the fundamentals that goes into development, and if we look at the last 2 years, the time to learn was less, right? Schools were shut down, and then when they went on to online, they was much less hours of instruction for most school districts. So we had less time to learn. The quality of the learning was decreased. So one, obviously in the remote environment, the vast majority, not all, because there's variables, but the vast majority of schools, the learning was a lower level of quality. And then when schools got back in person, we still had massive attendance issues of kids because COVID was still hitting. And we also had significant attendance of adults. And so if you think about the idea of quality of learning, it was just less in the 21-22 school year, even though schools were back in session. Even though a lot of money was allocated, the schools really didn't have the plans or the personnel to put that money into place. And then when you think about readiness to learn, the vast majority of kids were going through just different types of mental health issues. And we think about our kids living in poverty who had much more exposure to actual death and housing insecurity and food insecurity. There was a lot less there. So the end result is that, we're exactly where we are. Obviously, the focus has got to be how do we do more going forward. And I think that the focus for all of us right now is to dig into the details and figure out there are some anomalies out there, some districts that did better than others. And this is something I think as a collective sector, we just don't do enough actual analysis to really think about what were the specific things put in place. So you'll read a lot of people say, hey, tutoring. The question is, how much tutoring? Like, how much did each kid get? How did they identify the kids that got that tutoring? What was the actual program used for tutoring? Same thing on summer school, where districts that did better, they actually have kids in more summer school with more time. So, all the data came out on Monday, and the work ahead with focus right now, which should happen fast and should be top priority for not just the state, but for nonprofits, is digging into the data to find out which districts and which schools actually did better, particularly for economically disadvantaged kids, because as Vince mentioned, that's just where the biggest challenge remains in the state by far. And what specific strategies did they actually utilize, which is where we just don't get to that level of analysis enough to be able to move the work forward faster.
Marshall, thank you. Neil?
Yeah, so I think what those numbers are telling us are that different students had very different experiences during the pandemic. We've been studying COVID-19 and education for the past 2 years, and we've seen how students from marginalized groups have been left behind in each defining moment of the pandemic. And I would just highlight 3 data points. So in spring 2020, when schools shift into distance learning mode almost overnight, 40% of Black students did not have reliable internet. And as a result, those students did not receive any live instruction from teachers at all. And also, Marshall mentioned the food insecurity and also housing insecurity. Those things went up too. And at some point at the beginning of the pandemic, 40% of Black families did not have sufficient food to eat. So, and in the fall of 2020, both Vince and Marshall talked about the enrollment decline. And in spring of 2021, that's when most of the California districts started to reopen. And again, we see another layer of inequity happening there. The average district reopened on about April 25th. But when you look at districts with a lot of Black students or Latino students, they actually reopened much later. So students in those districts spend 6 more weeks in distance learning. So again, when you take together all of those factors, it is inevitable that we're going to see a test score decline, particularly among students from marginalized groups.
Great news, thank you. I want to again let people know if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the text. You can also direct message me and I'd be happy to ask them. So just want to remind folks of that. To our panelists, students weren't doing well prior to 2020 and prior to the pandemic in California. Has the pandemic allowed for perhaps some new opportunities for movement on the long-term issues that have been facing California's K-12 system?
Yeah, so I'll kick off and then Neo and Vince can jump in. I think the first point you made, Brian, which is schools haven't done well for a long time, is something we got to focus on, because there's a lot of attention, obviously, on the pandemic and the learning loss, but we've had just massive gaps between economically disadvantaged families, kids, and non-economically disadvantaged for decades. And we talk about massive gaps. Let me just give you a sense of the data today, which has been pretty consistent, as Vince mentioned, in terms of our gaps. You're at a point where, in English, for example, 65% of kids that are not low income are at proficient or above, and a very small amount of them are actually does not meet standards, which is very, very low. But you've only got 35,000 kids, 35% of the kids, 65% are proficient, 35% are of economically disadvantaged kids are below are proficiency. And you would literally have 40% that are in the lowest gap. So you have a 30-point gap between 65% higher income, 35% low income in English. And that gap is 51% math for higher income, 21% for low income. And that has been consistent for a long time. And when you look at the lowest, what is called has not met standards, which essentially is you're really not having any success at all. Opportunity is not going to be yours if you graduate and you're at has not met standards. You're at over 50% of low-income kids in math and 40% in English. And again, these have been consistent for a long time. So I share that in the sense that we talk about public schools in California. Ultimately, if you are middle class or above, the public schools generally work okay or better for you. And if you're not, they don't work well for the vast majority of low-income kids. And that has been the case for a couple of decades. As Vince mentioned, we've made progress as a state on increasing the floor for everybody, but have actually not shut those gaps. So I share all that in the sense that the urgency of the pandemic, I think, is critical, but we still have this massive urgency, which is public schools in California do not work well for the majority of low-income kids. And that is just a fact, and not just public schools, but the overarching system. And so I do think that there have been at least an additional focus coming to the pandemic, and the silver lining and possibility is, we've made big pushes on TK for our kids. We're pushing on expanded learning after school and summer, which are areas where there's deep inequities. So I think there's been a lot of legislation passed. The question is, are we going to implement that well, and what does that look like going forward?
Yeah, great, Marshall, thank you. New, Vince, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I think, building on Marshall's comments, and I guess before I do that, I would just add one other thing is I think, we have to put all of this in context, which from where I sit, I think, the pandemic hit poor communities of color much harder than other communities in this state. And I think what we saw in our schools and what we saw happening with our students is a reflection of that. That being said, I do think that there were some areas where we were able to focus more attention and could, I think, be bright spots as we move forward. So clearly the pandemic laid bare the enormous digital divide that existed in this state. And I think we really got serious about addressing that as time moved on. I think, the emphasis on teacher professional development and teacher preparation and the investments in both of those things, particularly in trying to bring more teachers into the profession, diversify the teaching profession, are things that we want to see continue. And then the other area that I think we're seeing a lot of attention being paid is with respect to student mental health and well-being. I think we saw through this pandemic how much students struggled for a variety of reasons. And I think it just sort of reinforced this notion that we have to be thinking about how are students doing from an emotional standpoint, a mental standpoint, and trying to address those needs as well, and really looking at what are the needs of the whole child, if you will. So I think things like community schools offer a lot of promise. So as much as these results are sobering, I'm hopeful that they will be a catalyst for us to really make some significant progress as we move forward, given some of the significant investments made in a variety of areas. And Marshall touched on expanded learning and the professional development and TK and all those sorts of things.
Great, Vince, thank you. Neil, I invite you to jump in on this, and then we'll go to some of the questions that are coming in my text as well.
Sure. I'll just add a quick note about teacher shortage, which, before the pandemic, as we all know, California has a chronic teacher shortage, especially in math, science, and also in special education field. And what we're seeing is during the pandemic, the teacher shortage has actually gotten a lot worse. And recently, we have some data from the national from the national level. It shows that more than half of the public schools, they felt understaffed entering the 2022-23 2022-23 school year, which is the current school year. And again, that's more than half of the schools. Before pandemic, the number was about 20% of schools. So that was a really quite a big jump there. And also nearly 3/4 of the districts reported difficulty hiring teachers in math, science, and also in special education. So I think, on teacher shortage, before the pandemic, we've got a chronic issue, but the pandemic actually really exacerbated the shortage. So on the good news side, we know that there's an unprecedented level of funding coming from the federal and state. So for instance, 3 rounds of federal stimulus dollars delivered more than $25 billion into California public schools to help schools recover. We also have some of the state big investments, like the community school initiative that Vince mentioned. There's also this year, there's a $7 billion learning recovery emergency fund to help schools recover as well.
Great, thank you. What I'd like to do is read a couple of questions from our audience, and then folks on our panel can kind of jump in and respond as appropriate. First one, how much the divergence of California data from the national average due to different concentrations of subgroups that were more, how much of the divergence between California national average data is due to different concentrations of subgroups more impacted by distance learning? So that's one. And then let me go to a second one. Per Marshall's point, is it possible to identify any best practices or even worst practices from the data that districts can learn from? So let me start with those two. Any reactions from our panel on one or both?
I can take a first stab at the first one. So I think in the research literature, we have a number of studies showing that
Oh, I think we may have lost you.
And the recent test score data coming from the federal and also state are quite recent. So for us, we haven't got a chance to really dig deeper into this. But based on the literature, we know that how long school stayed in fully remote mode has been a leading factor in predicting some of the achievement gaps we're seeing during the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. We lost you just for a minute there, but I think we got the core. Vince, Marshall, do you want to weigh in on either of these two questions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll weigh in on the second. I think this whole notion of so what do we do moving forward? What can we learn from this data? I actually think that reveals work that needs to be done in the state, which is, we can do a much better job in terms of our reporting and data collection. When we look at things like local control and accountability plans, there's a lot of reporting there. How good that reporting is at the end of the day in terms of us being able to identify best practices and how do we sort of disseminate that information and ensure that it's sort of shared with other districts addressing similar issues. We definitely need to do more there. I think it was widely reported in publications like EdSource that a lot of the federal COVID relief dollars that came into the state had very little reporting requirements tied to those. So I think as we look at these investments, it's going to be really important that we have more fiscal transparency and accountability as to how the dollars are going to be spent and to what extent are they actually having an impact on improving student outcomes. Otherwise, I think we miss a huge opportunity here, and that's just something we're trying to work on.
Vince, thank you. Marshall, you want to jump in on one or both?
I just one thing that, just because I couldn't agree more with Vince on that. The challenge we have as a state is we can look at the data, all of us, and we're all running data, I'm sure right now, about which schools actually perform better. But the question of why, we have such little data on what strategies specifically are these schools actually using that is moving instruction. Again, whether that be they're getting more time for low-income kids, whether that be that they're investing in really high-quality instruction materials, whether that be because they're actually doing, pull-out tutoring. So like to Vince's point, we really lack in sort of any meaningful infrastructure and districts from a culture and a focus perspective where we really say, hey, we're going to try these 4 programs and let's see if they actually work. And so we can truly identify what were the key levers that led to increased achievement, or for the places that fell further faster, what didn't they do? And that's where and we have to get to that point. And it's both at a state level and a district level. We're much, much more disciplined about using data and then also clarifying what are the goals and the strategies we're using so we can specifically try to pinpoint better what are those key levers that are leading to much more success? And the one thing I'll say also, the first question, and I'm just reading as fast as everybody else can because the data just came out on Monday, but there was a big release from some folks at Stanford and Harvard that had analyzed the data on with the NAEP scores, the national scores in particular, that it was a little surprising that there wasn't as direct a correlation on schools being closed and the results. There certainly has an impact, but it's a good reminder there were other factors involved. And again, there's some more analysis to be done. So it certainly was a factor, but at least the results they had said it looked like fourth grade math, there was a direct correlation. For the other areas, not as direct. And it was a factor, but not necessarily the only factor, which again, a lot of us do the work, so we know that, but I'm interested to dig further and really get arms around what were the other factors, connectivity, as Neo mentioned, there's some other ones beyond just schools being open or closed that we got to dig into.
So who do we rely on to analyze these data? Is it academic institutions? Are there states that do this very well? Are there districts in California that do this very well? Are there any best practices here in terms of really leveraging our data that we can point to?
I think there's a lot of groups that do it. The problem, it's all separate. I think what we need to do is have the nonprofits work together with each other more directly. And then over time, if a state was very, very focused on reflection and learning, the state would be the leader on it, being very, very open to these things. And then also probably passing some policies requiring a little more information, not more pages, because we ask a lot of pages of written documents from districts, but more specifics on strategies leading to results. So I think there's real work to be done for the sector to work together better. So it's not just this university here, this nonprofit there doing their one-off reports, but actually a much more coordinated effort on data, and then working on the best practices side with district superintendents in the state on what actual practices were being utilized. So we have huge room for growth, but real opportunity, and hopeful that's going to happen soon.
Great. Vince, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, and just to make one additional point there, because I think, and I use kind of the local control and accountability plans kind of as an example. I want to say the one for LA Unified is 300-400 pages, if not more. So, I'm not suggesting that we necessarily need to be reporting more. I think we need to improve the quality of the data that we're asking for. And we've reached out to some district leaders and said, look, let's streamline the reporting requirements. So you don't have to report on what really doesn't matter, but let's get the information that's going to be most useful to us. I was on a call yesterday where we were talking with a lot of teachers who work with English learners. Time is such a critical issue for them that they don't need additional burdens, but we just need to extract, I think, more and better information so we can make these decisions in an informed way.
Great, Vince, do you want to weigh in on this too?
Sure. Just a quick note about some of the data limits, because during the pandemic, a lot of data we have right now are lagging data. So a lot of the challenges is how to collect those really real-time data so we can actually use data to help inform some of the policy making. So for instance, we don't know, we know that California districts started reopening in spring 2021, but what happened in the fall of 2020? So we know some districts reopened, some schools reopened much earlier, but we don't know where those districts are, and also what are the shared students in each, in remote, in hybrid, or in-person mode throughout the pandemic. There's a lot of unknowns there as well.
Great news, thank you. And let me call also on Scott Richards from Teach for America. Scott, did you want to weigh in on this topic as well? Thankfully, there are a lot of experts in this group. We're not limited to just a few, which is great. Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I think something that when I was listening to Marshall and Vince and talk about this, it reminded me of the core districts that were organized in California. I think it's 8 districts that have over a number of years focused on using data to drive continuous improvement. And it just made me wonder, if there's an opportunity. I don't know what work you all have done with the core districts or how you might have intersected with them, but given that there is some infrastructure in place, depending on what they were able to do over the past few years, it makes me wonder what learning we could glean from those districts in particular, since they represent communities across California and helping us kind of understand these questions that you guys are raising. Because I think from my view, it's critical for us to figure out ways to utilize data in ways that can drive improvement. I think these are a group of districts that have been doing that for some time.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think to that point, Scott, I think the focus for all the kind of nonprofit community is take places like the core districts like other nonprofits that have been collecting data and like look at all of it and say, how do we just do it better together? Because and then eventually over time, hopefully pave the way for the state to do that. But to your point, a lot of folks are doing different pieces of work. Core districts are doing it very well because they connect the data with the actual practice because the districts are included in the collaborative. But as a state, if you think about it, until we get serious about, and to Vince's point, it's not about quantity, it's quality, but like collecting a lot of data and then understanding how that ties back to practice, we're just not going to be able to improve as fast as we need to, and we lose out for kids. You think about the private sector and how they're kind of utilizing data and practices to just continually get better. It's just not happening in education. It hasn't for a long time. And I think that's got to be just the biggest area to find out what is working, and then how do we help school classrooms and schools and districts do more of what's working, because that is also a problem as well, where there's some cases where we actually know what's working, but we're actually not making the changes on the ground. And so that there's work to be done. Also, Brian, just heads up, there's a couple of questions in the chat too. I don't know if you saw those earlier, but
yeah, I'm working my way through them. So I've got a few. So let me ask one that ties in with a question I was hoping to get to as well. One of our questions was, do the panelists have ideas for changes in public schools that are needed for schools to work for all students? And so let me focus on that a little bit. Let's look in the short term. So as we look out to 2023, whether it's at the district level or the state level, are there one or a couple of things the panelists think, yeah, these are things that we need to do from a policy perspective or in terms of implementing already existing policy to improve outcomes, and particularly for those kids that we've discussed that are not being well served, those kids lower socioeconomic groups and other disadvantaged groups? Niu, would you want to jump in first this time?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So I think I've mentioned earlier, the good news right now is districts have a lot of resources to help them implement some of the overdue changes to improve the conditions of schools and also accelerate student learning. So for instance, federal stimulus dollars delivered more than 25 billion to public schools. And so at the state level, we need to understand the types of learning recovery programs that are undertaken by districts. So for instance, where do those money go? What are those learning recovery programs for whom, and also do they work? So towards then, and we know right now data is a challenge. So we actually have a public research practice partnership with the California Department of Education in collaboration with researchers from UC Berkeley and UC San Diego. What we're trying to do is to tackle where those stimulus dollars go, what kind of programs have been implemented, and most importantly, the association, do those programs work? To what extent are those programs closing the equity gaps in student achievement? So in the next year or two, we hope to release some studies providing some answers to some of the emerging questions.
Great, Niu, thank you. Marshall, Vince?
Yeah, I think two things I would mention is I think we need to maintain our focus on early learning. So, the investments in transitional kindergarten, looking at, universal preschool for all. The other area that I think we want to pay close attention to, and we're looking at this, is the distribution of teachers. We know that oftentimes it's the teachers that are new to the profession, least prepared and ready to teach, that are going into the schools with the greatest needs and educating the kids with the greatest challenges. So how do we look at that structure and figure out a way to get, our better qualified teachers into those classrooms where there are the greatest challenges? And that's data that's not easy to come by.
Yeah, thank you, Vince. Marshall?
Yeah, I think one thing that's, to me, has been overdue for a couple of years or for many years, but certainly the pandemic showed it front and center, is we just have to have broadband for all kids in public schools at home and computers. I mean, you think about, we pay for kids to have textbooks, we pay for kids to have desks, we pay for kids to have, schools to go to. Learning is so much done by technology these days. And if we want to think about how do we have kids do more work after school, over summer, at night, you have to have a computer and broadband high speed at home. And that to me just is something we have to just take care of immediately. And just like we fund, free meals for low-income kids, we got to do free broadband and computers immediately. And it shouldn't be left to school districts. The state should mandate this. The money is there for it. And if you think about how you learn in 2022, the idea that a child can have any chance of equity and opportunity without being able to access the internet for learning from home is just doesn't make sense at all for schools. So that to me is just a absolute high no-brainer priority. I think also to kind of to Vince's point on the pre-K, we look at the data that the achievement gaps actually start in kindergarten. I mean, it's something that we got a lot of work to do as a state. We don't collect data really statewide until third grade, which is a miss, but the gaps are consistent, and some folks have done some work there. So we actually did pass transitional kindergarten. So 4-year-olds get free education going forward. The implementation of that is essential. Again, you think about what are the fundamentals of learning. It's time to learn, quality of learning, and your overall readiness to learn as a child. And the reality is wealthier kids have a much more time before they start kindergarten. They're all getting preschool and pre-K age 3, 4, a lot of supports at age 2, and low income kids don't. So essential that we deliver. We've actually passed the money already. Let's deliver on quality implementation for 4-year-olds and then move towards 3-year-olds. And then the other thing is, we also passed money for expanded learning. So again, I think for both TK and expanded learning, it's about the implementation side for the next year versus new policy. It's about how we put in work. We put $5 billion a year on after school and summer. This is another place where wealthier families spend 10x more on after school and summer than low income families. So not surprising, you're going to keep seeing gaps not shrinking if you have more support there. How we're using that money, what are districts spending it on? Is it working? Is it going to more learning for kids? That to me is just an absolute critical factor for both expanded learning for TK and for all these policies. We passed a lot of money last year. What's it going to and what's working for kids so we can spread good practices really quickly?
Yeah, great, Marshall. Thank you. Hey, I want to go to Paul Baker's question in the text about charter schools and the role of charter schools in the broader ecosystem and how they interact with public schools in terms of helping our kids. Can anybody weigh in on that topic?
I'll start and then turn it over. So haven't seen data yet for the most recent post-pandemic, but I think the best study for charter schools in California, Paul, Credo out of Stanford did a study where the takeaway was in cities, in urban areas, charter schools were tending to do better for low-income Blacks and Latinos, but not necessarily the same case for whites and Asians, and also not outside of urban areas, was the study that Mackie Raymond had done out of the Credo group out of Stanford as a part of the kind of getting down to the facts, which was a large collective initiative in 2018. That was the last big study that we've seen. My guess is we'll see coming out of the pandemic some studies on that. I haven't seen it yet. I don't think anyone's run the numbers yet, but it's kind of in urban districts, particularly with some of the higher quality charters, you've seen improvements for those students, and that's pretty research based for Blacks and Latinos, but not for whites and Asian, and not outside of cities. So it's again, like most things in education, it's kind of like depends. You can't make the case like charter's better for all, but you could make the case that in at least Stanford and data driven in the big urban areas of the state, Blacks and Latinos, yes, on more progress, and not the case for whites and Asians.
I guess I asked the question from the standpoint of exactly that, wondering exactly that, because we spend money on charter schools outside the urban areas, and I think it detracts from the public schools as a result. I wish the charter movement could be constrained to where it knows that where we know it works and not employed elsewhere. That's why I asked the question.
Well, thank you. You or Vince, do you want to jump in on this topic?
I mean, I would just add to that. I think quality instruction is quality instruction, whether we're talking a traditional public school or a public charter school. So, and we see great charters and we see some not so much, just like we see in the traditional school setting. I think it's all about sort of what can we learn from what's happening in the classroom and what's happening with student outcomes that can be replicated irrespective of the model that's being employed.
Great, Vince, thank you. New, any
So I'm going to waste a little bit more time if it's okay. Sorry.
It's all good.
Do you think there's any way to do the measurement without it being high stakes? Right? What you always hear is teach to the test, but we don't want to teach to the test. What we want to do is teach and try to understand what works and what doesn't work. But measurement is always so high stakes that I wonder, is it difficult to get accurate answers as a result? Anyways. And I'm an engineer and don't know anything about education, so ignore me if I'm out of
No,
out of the
Paul,
area.
this stuff is at the heart of things. Folks, anybody want to weigh in on this?
So I think in education, we've seen some districts that are actually doing formative assessments. So those are the assessments and teachers, for instance, they give when teachers are doing the in-classroom instructions. So those are typically considered low-stake assessments. And they're really helpful to help teachers improve their instruction and also just to track and also monitor students' progress over time. And over the years, we know sometimes, there's a lot of unintended consequences coming from the top-down accountability measures, which includes standardized assessment and also accountability or high-stakes accountability. So we've seen some movement in, at least, in districts that, they're shifting away from more high-stake testing for using more timely and also formative assessment, just trying to measure student learning in a different way and also trying to improve teaching and learning. And also we've seen some districts are using, more competence-based measures. So for instance, project-based learning that they're trying to see, it's not about teaching to the test, but what kind of skills, what kind of knowledge can students master by the end of the course. So those are some of the, so I think it can be done in education, and I think it's already happening in a lot of the places across the state.
Well, one thing I will add, because I'm a big fan of what Nia said in terms of the formative assessments, but we can't learn quickly without some standardized assessments. Like we have to learn what practices are working across schools and across districts, particularly for low-income kids, to have any shot at what we all are in this work for, which is every child having real opportunity by the time they're an adult. And I do tend to think that if you look across the data, the state tests, the SAT, ACT, a lot of the tests that are taken, even that there's some correlation grad rates, particularly college ready, like we can find a right balance where we have, and I think it's a culture issue for schools where we have standardized tests, and people are comfortable using those as tools to learn from rather than tools to be penalized by. And I think the way they were introduced was problematic because there's probably more penalty originally when it was launched in the first decade of the 21st century. But we got to get that culture where you see a lot of high performing organizations where using data is a good thing, not a fearful thing. And that's still a work in progress in public education.
Marshall, thanks. Vince, you want to weigh in on this?
I mean, I think Marshall and New have pretty much covered it and said what I would have contributed.
Great. Well, let's stick on this topic for a minute, because obviously these test scores that have just, and Patrick, then I'll go to you in just a minute. The test scores that have come out obviously are driving this discussion. But we all know that they are but one metric of school quality and student performance. Are there other metrics that you deem particularly important? And these may be academic metrics, they may be other measures of student well-being. Vince, you want to kick off this time?
Yeah, I think two things that I think we should be looking at. One is chronic absenteeism. Clearly we lost a lot of kids during the pandemic, and that is continuing. So what is driving chronic absenteeism? Because obviously if the kids aren't in school, they're not learning. So I think that's one metric. And then I'd return to this issue of school climate. One of the things we'd like to see are sort of annual school climate surveys that are done with standardized questions that schools are required to use. So we get a better feel for, sort of the overall and full experience that students are having at school and in the classroom. So I think those, beyond the test scores, I think those would be informative.
Excellent. Marshall, and you?
Yeah, I obviously looking at graduation rates and then also college-ready graduation rates. I think that, but beyond that, the two areas, we've made some progress, but still not there. We just got to actually see how many kids are actually going to college and completing college and doing that across the way like that. That just, again, in 2022, the fact that, again, we've made progress, but the fact we're not totally there, so we can truly see, which kids come from which school districts at what economic levels are actually finishing community college, finishing four-year college, and when, and look backwards. The technology is there. We just haven't chosen to get there. And I know we're making some progress. And then also on the career side, again, we talk a lot about college and career. Like what's the point of public education? The point of public education, and not just public education, but I think the youth supports around that, pre-K, after school, summer, et cetera, is to ensure that every child, when they become adult, is prepared to either go to college and have success or go to a career that can make some money over time and have a decent living. And yet we have almost no metrics for identifying. We talk a lot about now about like getting kids career ready, but we're not measuring what jobs do they actually go into if they go straight to college, straight into the career or to the workforce or the apprenticeship program. And what does that look like over time in terms of their success? And again, those are things that we got to make the choices to get that data, because without really looking at both like college success and career trajectory, both for kids who go to careers right out of high school in particular, we just have to get that data to know if we're doing a good job preparing kids to maximize opportunity. And we get, again, there's pieces of it now, and we're making some progress, but nowhere near fast enough. It should be a top priority for the state.
So I want to go to you on this question of other metrics, but I want to dig down real quick on this. The question that just came up in the text from Debbie. Do panelists have thoughts about CD's Cradle to Career System initiative and how it might contribute to outcome analysis? So I guess this is, correct me if I'm wrong, the longitudinal data system that we've been seeking now for a long time. Where does that stand, and what are your thoughts on this question?
I was going to Neil. I'll just say, when I was saying like we're making some progress, I was referring to we passed that. Somebody's allocated. We're moving forward on the Cradle Career. It's a must, and we got to do that really, really well. I mean, like a lot of things in education, the key is going to be the implementation side. So that like having the good news is the governor put some money aside. There's a project there, but that needs to be done extremely well. It should be a top priority, the execution of that. So that's when I was referring to, we're making some progress. I was referring to that, but we got some work to do to finalize it. Okay, great.
You, Vince, you want to opine on this, and then you again. I want to get back to the other metrics we talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Cradle to Career data system offers a lot of potential and promise. You know, they're at the stage now of really linking K-12 to post-secondary. As I think we build in the early learning or early childhood data, that's going to be a challenge because that's not really a system in the sense of we think of systems, and then bringing in the workforce data is going to be critical to Marshall's point. And I think, you know, as we move forward, those data systems are going to be particularly important as we look at college going rates, because now as we move into an environment where we are probably not going to see the SAT and ACT as the major driver for college readiness and then college eligibility and admissions, it really lifts the stakes around high school curriculum, your A to G courses, access to AP exams, all those sorts of things. And we know that there are huge disparities in terms of economically disadvantaged kids and kids of color in terms of being able to access those sorts of things. So that data system, I think, is going to be really critical.
And thank you. And we would love to hear about both thoughts on the longitudinal data system and state thereof, and then also additional metrics, the earlier question.
Yeah, sure. So I agree. I think once the C2C, once it is fully built, it will be absolutely critical to answer some of the really pressing policy issues, especially when it comes to student learning and also learning recovery. And so one of the things about the C2C or the data general is going back to the original question about the missing data. I think one piece of the missing data right now is student engagement. So Vince touched on the chronic absenteeism, and then we know that between the fall of 2019 and fall of 2021, the public school actually lost 270,000 students. So where did those students go? We know some of them might move out of state, some of them enrolled into public school, private schools. And we also know that a lot of high school students actually took up minimum wage jobs and then foregoing their education altogether. So, but depending on where those students end up with, you know, the policy solutions are going to be very different. And so I think right now we don't have the data to really dive into what happened to those students. And so to some extent we're flying blind to some extent. And the other thing is a lot of those data, they come with a lag. So most of them come with a 1-year lag. And because of this, sometimes we actually miss the critical window to develop some policy intervention and also to help those students, help them get back on track.
Yeah, great news, thank you. So what about examples of other states and nations that you have seen that really, if you were to point to one place and say, this is where California should be in 5 years or 10 years, are there really models that we can follow in your view? Vince, why don't I pick on you first?
I thought you might do that. I actually struggled a bit with this question because I really could not, I mean, I think we see other states that are showing bright spots, whether that's, achievement in English language arts or math or what have you. But then I see someone put Massachusetts into the chat. I think, the challenge that I've witnessed over my years in doing policy work is, California is so unique in many ways, just the size of the system, the diversity of the students that we're dealing with, some of the structural barriers that we have in our systems. So, I struggle with this, but perhaps, Marshall and New, who are much smarter than I am, might have some insights as to where those bright stars are.
All right, no pressure, y'all. You go ahead.
So I think it's pretty clear that for most of the states that returning to business as usual in education is just not possible. And we have to rethink education in a very deeply different ways. And also some of the lessons from the high performing states such as Massachusetts or New Jersey, or the high performing nations such as Finland or Singapore, are actually a lot of the things we already known about. So it's all about, we talk a lot about implementation, we talk about capacity to implement and also the resources to implement. So I think now we're at this really critical juncture that this actually is the moment to try to use those money to create some long-lasting changes in the system. And I'll mention a few of those lessons from those high-performing states or nations. So first, we really need to close the digital divide. Even though schools have returned to in-person learning, but most of them will continue to use technology to communicate with parents, to facilitate teaching and learning. And also, we also know that, in California, we have wildfires that is increasing in frequency and also intensity. So next time when there's a natural disaster or the pandemic, we need to make sure that students are having access to quality instruction, regardless of their zip code. So they will not miss out opportunity to learn because of policy failures. And we've also talked about social emotional learning. And one thing that is just shocking is, a national survey of high school students show that 10% of them lost their family members during COVID-19. So there's lots of trauma going on in schools. So we have to really support students' social and emotional learning. And also it is really time to treat, teaching as a profession. And this means much better preparation, better pay, and also better working conditions. And we know from decades of research, we know that teaching or highly effective teacher is the single most important school level factor in student learning. So we need to make sure that every student is being taught by highly effective teachers, and also that the teacher diversity really reflects the diversity of our students. So I just stop here.
Yeah, thank you. Marshall?
Yeah, so I had the same list actually as Neo in terms of the NAEP scores. Massachusetts, New Jersey seem to be up there, and then internationally, Finland, Singapore, South Korea. But to Vince's point, it comes down to the next level of analysis in this work, right? So why? And I think of, again, schools in a very simple kind of framework, which is, time for kids to learn, the quality of that teaching and learning, and then the kids' overall readiness in terms of what's else going on in that child's life. And if you look at those countries, you'll tend to see, particularly in places like Singapore and South Korea, a lot more time for student learning, not necessarily always in school, can be after school, but they have just much greater investment in time for kids. You look at Finland, much deeper investment in actual teacher and teacher quality, right? And so if you think about as a state, what we need to do is get more time for kids, particularly post-pandemic. We lost time, so you need more time. We got to actually double down on heavy investments in teachers, get more people to come into the profession, dramatically shift our teacher training programs so we're training teachers more effectively and have more time for teachers to work with each other. And then there's obviously the readiness point in terms of our young people who are coming in with more food insecurity, housing insecurity, et cetera, that need more support. And if you look on those three metrics, time, quality of learning, and then also readiness, on all those areas, economically disadvantaged kids just have much greater challenges, right? They have less pre-K, less after school summer. They tend to actually have less quality instruction in their classroom, a lot more challenges in society. And our system doesn't actually address that at the level that warrants the gaps. And that's what has to change. You know, pre-pandemic, pandemic only made that clearer, which is a wholesale shift on how do we get more time, more quality instruction, more support, and a lot more just underlying access for our kids of greatest need. And the system isn't designed for that today. And it's not just K-12, it's pre-K and it's after school and summer plus K-12 if we want to maximize real access to equal opportunity for young people in California.
Yeah. Well, folks, I think that is a great way to end. We're near the top of the hour. I want to thank everyone for being here with us. I want to especially thank Marshall and Vince and you for taking the time. Really appreciate it. This is an ongoing conversation, one of the most critical issues we face as a state, for sure. So thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Appreciate your time.
Good to see you all. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you. Take
Thank you.
care.